Raul was a man of simple ambitions, but sophisticated in his way of living. He cherished small gestures and believed happiness lay in the details of everyday life. When he met Ruth, it felt as though the universe had conspired in his favor. She was everything he had ever wanted in a partner. Intelligent, witty, and possessing a beauty that seemed to bloom even more in its simplicity. From the start, Ruth appeared to share the same outlook on life as he did, and their connection was immediate. They married in a small ceremony, attended only by family and close friends. Raul still remembered every detail of that day. Ruth's smile as they exchanged vows, the way she seemed to radiate happiness. He felt his life was finally complete. The years that followed were, for Raul, time of tranquility and growth. Ruth worked as a freelance writer with a flexible schedule, which allowed her to spend plenty of time at home. Raul, on the other hand, managed a sporting goods store. They built a harmonious routine together, filled with homemade dinners, weekend outings, and occasional trips to peaceful destinations. Yet, there were moments when Raul noticed something peculiar about Ruth's behavior. At times, she seemed a little different. It wasn't anything he could point to directly, but there were small changes, the way she spoke, dressed, or even reacted to everyday situations. He attributed it to the natural ups and downs everyone experiences, and didn't dwell on it too much. One evening, after a long day at work, Raul came home to find Ruth preparing dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air, and she seemed especially cheerful. They talked about their day while eating, and Ruth mentioned that she'd be busy in the coming days with a new writing project. "What's it about?" Raul asked, curious. "I'm still structuring the idea, but I think it'll be something involving family dramas." "It's a theme that has always fascinated me," she replied with an enigmatic smile. Raul laughed. "If you need inspiration, just look at our families. There's enough drama there already." Ruth smiled, but her gaze seemed distant for a moment, as if she were thinking about something beyond their conversation. In the days that followed, Ruth spent more time than usual away from home. She said she needed a different environment to concentrate on her writing. Raul didn't find it strange. He knew writers sometimes needed a change of scenery to spark creativity. Yet, a nagging unease began to stir within him. A doubt he couldn't quite name. One afternoon, while organizing some papers in the home office drawer, Raul came across an old photograph he had never seen before. It was Ruth, but something was different. He noticed the date written on the back. It was from before they had met. She was hugging a woman who looked identical to her. It was confusing, as though he were looking at Ruth in a mirror. He set the photo aside, thinking he might ask Ruth about it later, but decided against it for the time being. Meanwhile, the strange moments continued. Ruth, who had always been meticulous about schedules and commitments, started to be late more often. She also seemed to forget details of their conversations, something Raul found unusual. He began to wonder if she was simply overwhelmed with work. One Saturday morning, while having coffee together, Raul decided to comment, "You've seemed a bit distracted lately. Is everything okay?" Ruth looked up from her cup and smiled. "Just the stress from the project, darling. I promise it'll pass." Raul nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. The marriage, once so simple and stable, seemed to have taken on an air of mystery. Raul found himself reflecting on past moments, trying to identify patterns or explanations for the changes. Little did he know he was only beginning to unravel a web of secrets far deeper than he could have imagined. Days turned into weeks, and Raul's sense of unease only grew. Ruth seemed to oscillate between moments of intense attentiveness and strange emotional absences. At times, she was warm, loving, and attentive just as she had been since they married. But at other times, she became distant, as though physically present but emotionally elsewhere. One afternoon, on his way home from work, Raul decided to make an unplanned stop at a local cafe where Ruth often wrote. She had mentioned she would be there during the day, working on her project. When he entered, the place was bustling with people chatting and typing on laptops. He looked around but didn't see Ruth. Feeling slightly uneasy, he asked one of the baristas if they had seen a woman matching her description. "Oh, yeah, Ruth was here earlier. She left about an hour ago. the barista replied after thinking for a moment. Raul thanked them, but something felt off. He knew Ruth had said she'd be at the cafe until late afternoon. He called her, but the call went straight to voicemail. He decided not to push it, but the feeling that something was wrong lingered. When he got home, he found Ruth in the kitchen, stirring a pot. She smiled when she saw him, but there was something odd about the way her eyes avoided his. "Did you leave the cafe early?" he asked casually. Ruth paused for a moment before responding. "Yes, I needed some fresh air and decided to go for a walk." Raul nodded, but the explanation felt too vague. He knew she wasn't the type to abandon a workspace so abruptly, especially when she was inspired. Still, he chose not to press her. Something told him that waiting and observing would be more effective. Over time, Raul began paying closer attention to the small details. Certain habits of Ruth seemed to change from one day to the next. One example was how she drank her coffee. Ruth had always preferred black coffee, no sugar, but one morning, he saw her adding milk and stirring it as if it were completely natural. When he commented on it, she simply laughed and said, "Sometimes we change, don't you think?" Another strange thing was her memory. Ruth often forgot details of recent events, like conversations they had or plans they made. One evening, Raul mentioned a dinner with friends the previous Saturday, and Ruth seemed genuinely confused. "Dinner? No, you must be mistaken. We spent Saturday at home watching that movie." What was it called? A chill ran down Raul's spine. He knew he wasn't mistaken. That dinner had happened, and Ruth had been there, chatting animatedly with their friends. He decided not to push the matter, but made a mental note of the incident. The breaking point came on a Sunday when Raul was invited to a barbecue at his brother Thomas's house. Ruth had always enjoyed family gatherings, but that morning, she claimed to be feeling unwell. "Go without me, darling. I don't want to ruin your afternoon," she said, curling up on the couch with a blanket. Raul hesitated but eventually agreed. However, while at the barbecue, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He decided to return home earlier than planned. When he entered, he expected to find Ruth still resting on the couch, but the house was empty. He called out for her, but there was no response. Her phone was on the coffee table, as though it had been left in a hurry. That night, when Ruth finally returned, she seemed calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. Raul decided to confront her indirectly. "I stopped by the cafe where you usually work the other day," he said, trying to gauge her reaction. "Oh, really? That's nice. How was it?" she replied, unfazed. "The barista mentioned you left early. I thought that was odd since you usually spend the whole day there." Ruth shrugged. "I guess I wasn't feeling very inspired that day." "I don't see why it's such a big deal." Raul felt the weight of the invisible wall Ruth seemed to be building between them. He knew there was something she wasn't telling him, but he also knew that forcing a confession wasn't the way forward. It was as if she were constantly shifting form, a shadow of herself that he couldn't quite grasp. That night, as Ruth slept, Raul took out the photograph he had found weeks earlier. He studied the face of the woman beside Ruth. The resemblance was uncanny, but there were small differences: a slightly different haircut, the way her eyes seemed to carry a distinct energy. Who was she, and why had Ruth never mentioned her? In the days that followed, Raul carefully balanced observation with maintaining normalcy. He knew that to uncover the answers he sought, he would need to be patient. What he didn't yet know was that the answers he sought were much closer and far more devastating than he could ever have imagined. Raul woke up that morning with a sense of unease. Something inside him felt off, as if his subconscious were trying to tell him something his conscious mind couldn't yet grasp. Ruth was beside him, sleeping soundly, but for the first time in a long while, he felt as if he didn't completely know her. It was a disconcerting, almost paralyzing sensation. In recent months, small details had started to emerge, each stranger than the last. Sometimes Ruth seemed to forget important conversations they'd had, as if they had never occurred. Other times, her preferences seemed to change overnight. The way she folded clothes, organized the kitchen, or even drove it all seemed different at times. Raul had tried to brush it off, convincing himself that it was just his overactive mind or his own inability to remember the details of daily life. After all, who hasn't experienced something like that in a long marriage? But in that moment, as he watched Ruth's serene face in the soft morning light, he realized he couldn't ignore it any longer. After getting up and preparing breakfast, Raul decided to take the day off work. He needed time to process his thoughts. Ruth woke up shortly after, surprised to see him still at home. "Didn't you go to work today?" she asked, frowning. "No, I decided to take the day off to rest. I thought it might be nice for us to spend some time together," Raul replied, watching her expression closely. She hesitated for a moment before smiling. "That's a surprise. Let's do something special then." Throughout the day, they strolled around the city, visited a bookstore Ruth loved, and had lunch at a charming downtown restaurant. Raul made an effort to act naturally, but his mind raced, analyzing every word, every gesture, every glance from Ruth. Something inside him screamed that there was a buried secret, something he had to uncover. That night, while Ruth slept soundly beside him, Raul couldn't close his eyes. He got up quietly and went to the office. He opened his laptop and began searching. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he was determined to find something to confirm or dispel his suspicions. He scoured social media, old emails, photos, anything that might provide clues. Among it all, he found something that caught his attention: an old photo of Ruth with another woman. They were identical. For a moment, Raul thought it was just a montage or a strange effect in the photo, but on closer examination, he noticed differences in small details. Could it be? Raul wondered. His mind raced back to the stories Ruth had told him about her family. She had never mentioned a twin sister. Why? Was it something she preferred to forget? Or was there something deeper, darker, behind that silence? The next day, Raul confronted Ruth, holding the photo in his hands. He showed it to her as soon as she entered the kitchen. "Who is this?" he asked, his voice firm but devoid of anger. Ruth looked at the photo, and for a moment, it seemed as if her world had stopped. Her expression quickly shifted from surprise to something Raul couldn't identify: fear, perhaps. "Where did you find that?" she asked, avoiding eye contact. "Answer my question. Who is this woman?" There was an uncomfortable silence before Ruth finally sighed and looked away. "She's my sister, my twin." Raul felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Why had Ruth never mentioned this before? Why hide something so significant? "Why didn't you tell me? This isn't something you just forget to share, Ruth. You've lied to me all these years?" "It's not that simple, Raul," she said, her voice trembling. "Ruby and we have a complicated history. She chose a very different path from mine, and I didn't want that to interfere with our life. I thought I was protecting you." Raul felt a mix of anger and confusion. On the one hand, he understood that families could be complicated, but on the other, he felt betrayed in a way he couldn't describe. "Protecting me? From what? Ruth, this doesn't make sense. What aren't you telling me?" Ruth hesitated, and Raul realized there was more behind her secret. But before she could respond, her phone rang. She answered quickly, and Raul couldn't hear the conversation, but her tone was urgent. When she hung up, her expression was pale. "I have to go. It's urgent." Ruth grabbed her bag and left without further explanation. Raul stood there in the kitchen, still holding the photo. He knew this story was far from over. In that moment, he decided he wouldn't wait for answers. He would find them himself. And deep down, something told him the truth would be far more disturbing than he could ever imagine. The perfect marriage Raul had envisioned began to crumble after the devastating discovery. Ruth had a twin sister, Ruby, whose existence had been kept a secret all these years. This initial shock left him stunned, but the real blow was yet to come. As the pieces of the puzzle started to come together, Raul couldn't stop replaying strange and inexplicable moments throughout his relationship with Ruth. Habits that changed suddenly, memories that didn't align with what she said, even the scent of a different perfume on some occasions. He felt like a fool for not seeing the signs, but the truth was so absurd that his mind could never have conceived it. As Raul tried to process everything, Ruth finally agreed to sit down and tell him the story behind the secret. I never wanted it to be like this, she began, her voice heavy with guilt. Ruby had been an essential part of her life since birth. The two were inseparable but also competitive, always trying to outdo each other. When Ruth met Raul, Ruby initially supported the relationship, but soon feelings of jealousy and envy emerged. She convinced me she could help, Ruth admitted, her eyes fixed on the floor. It was supposed to be fun, harmless, but things got out of control. She explained how Ruby started occasionally taking her place, claiming it was a way to experience the life Ruth had. The pact between the sisters had started as a game, but turned into something darker. Raul sat in silence, trying to absorb Ruth's words. Each revelation felt like a blow, dismantling the foundations of everything he thought he knew about his marriage. He finally asked, "How many times did this happen?" Ruth's hesitation to answer was all he needed to understand it wouldn't be a simple response. "I'm not sure," she confessed. "More than I'd like to admit." Ruth explained that, at times, Ruby had overstepped their agreement. "She started living my life, Raul, and I let her." It was easier than facing the truth. Raul's fury and pain finally erupted. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You let her? You were okay with this? I was deceived for years, and you just let it happen?" His voice was a mix of incredulity and anger. Ruth reached for him, but he stepped back. "Raul, I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. I love you." To Raul, Ruth's words felt hollow. The love he thought they shared now seemed tainted by lies and manipulation. He left the house, needing space to think. As he drove aimlessly through the streets of Seattle, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He knew he needed answers, but he also knew the truth might destroy him even more. In the days that followed, Raul sought out Ruby. He needed to confront her, to hear her version of the story. When he finally found her, it was like looking at Ruth, but with a different presence, more confident, almost defiant. Ruby showed no remorse as she spoke about the pact with her sister. "I did it because I could," she said bluntly. "And you never noticed, so why stop?" Her words were a devastating blow to Raul, but they also motivated him to make a decision. He realized that to move forward, he needed to confront not only the twins, but also himself, and the reason he had failed to see the truth for so long. The tension between the three escalated, and what had been a dark secret began to unravel into a dangerous game of accusations, regrets, and the pursuit of redemption. Raul was determined to take control of his life again, but he knew the road to doing so would be painful and uncertain. He parked the car in front of the small roadside motel where he had arranged to meet Ruby. He had spent sleepless nights replaying every moment, every gesture, and every conversation from his marriage, trying to distinguish Ruth from Ruby. The task seemed impossible. His feelings fluctuated between anger, sadness, and a growing sense of deep betrayal. Now, he was determined to extract the whole truth, no matter the cost. When Ruby appeared, her expression was one of pure defiance. She didn't seem intimidated or remorseful. On the contrary, she carried an air of superiority that irritated Raul instantly. They sat at a table in the cafe attached to the motel, a discreet place where he knew they wouldn't be interrupted. "What do you want from me, Raul?" Ruby asked bluntly. She stirred her coffee cup absent-mindedly, as if this were just another trivial conversation. "I want to understand. I want to know why. Why did you do this to me?" Raul replied, struggling to contain the fury bubbling in his voice. Ruby shrugged, a small, provocative smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Because we could. And to be honest, because it was fun." "You're so predictable, Raul." It was too easy. Those words struck him like a knife through his heart. He fought to stay calm, but his voice trembled as he responded. "Fun? You're telling me you played with my life because you thought it was fun?" Ruby leaned forward, her gaze locked on his. "You don't get it, do you? Ruth always had everything. She was the favorite, the perfect one. When she met you, thought, why does she get to have that too? So, a capiche. It's not like you noticed." Raul felt a mix of contempt and pity for Ruby. Her envy and bitterness were evident, but that didn't justify what she had done. "You destroyed everything," he said, his voice quieter now. "Not just my marriage, but the trust I had. You two destroyed it. Ruby leaned back in her chair, bored. Don't pretend you're some perfect victim. If you really loved Ruth, you would have noticed. You were so busy with your work, with your idea of the perfect life. You weren't paying attention. Those words hit him like a punch in the stomach. Was it true? Had he really neglected Ruth to the point of missing something so fundamental? Raul shook his head, trying to push the thoughts away. That doesn't justify anything, he said firmly. I'll deal with Ruth, but I want you to tell me something. What was your plan? Were you going to keep up this charade forever? Ruby laughed, a cold, joyless sound. Plans change, and maybe now is the time to change everything. Raul narrowed his eyes, trying to decipher what she meant. But before he could ask, Ruby stood up. Good luck with Ruth, she said, throwing some dollar bills on the table to pay for the coffee. You'll need it. When Raul returned home that night, he found Ruth waiting for him. Her face was marked with exhaustion and anxiety. She knew he had met with Ruby and feared what might have been said. So, she asked, her voice hesitant, what do you want to do now? Raul stared at her for a long moment before responding. I want to hear from you, Ruth. I want to hear your version. No lies this time. Ruth swallowed hard and nodded. Okay, I'll tell you everything. She began to explain how Ruby had always been a dominant presence in her life, pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable. Ruth admitted that, at first, she felt relieved by the exchanges. It was an escape from her routine, a way to share the pressure of being perfect. But, over time, she lost control of the situation. I should have stopped, she said, her eyes welling up with tears. But every time I thought about confessing, feared losing you. And Ruby, she wasn't going to make it easy. Raul listened in silence, his emotions a mix of empathy and disgust. He realized that, despite everything, there was still a part of him that loved Ruth. But he knew he couldn't just forgive and forget. I need time, he finally said. Time to think, to understand how to move forward. But one thing is certain, this can't continue. Ruth nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. I'll do whatever it takes, Raul. I just want a chance to fix this. As she spoke, Raul felt a spark of hope. Maybe there was a way to rebuild his life, to find some form of redemption in this chaos. But he knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges. The truth had been exposed, and now it was time to face the consequences.